Hello everyone, and welcome to the world-renowned review of AMC's The Terror, Episode 10, entitled, We Are Gone. I am the world-renowned historian, and no, I did not forget that I hadn't made this yet. I wanted this review to be really awesome and professional for you guys, like I was really gonna bust my ass on the production values. And yet, here we are. Shooting this on my laptop's built-in cam because I left my webcam at a buddy's house. I got fans blasting in the background because it's hot as hell. You could probably hear the foil I put on my windows blowing in the wind because it's so disgustingly hot in here. The lighting in here is shit, especially with this webcam. But you know what? I'm here, and you're here, and hey, at least we're together. I got my glass of whiskey, I got my Jim Beam and my cherry Coke, so you know what? Let's talk about one of the greatest TV shows ever made. Just pretend we're on some 8mm film or something, some retro thing with the graininess. I am a historian after all. Just don't expect my usual dynamic camera angles, that's all I'm getting at. Well anyways, what a road, what a ride. For Crozier and Company, everything comes to an end here. The last of the stragglers are still pressing on, doing as they can to drag their broken bodies across the finish line, though the finish line is nowhere near. The monster stalks them, and a monstrous madness stalks even those who've held to themselves and kept themselves in this impossible situation. You fine folks will forgive my propensity for comparison. This episode brought to mind for me several previous films, most notably the Treasure of the Sierra Madre. That film was ostensibly about a partnership falling apart over gold, but, as Roger Ebert said, the film was never really about gold, but about character. It's really about the effects that a desolate, unforgiving, punishing landscape have on the human psyche. But in some ways even more so, this episode brought to mind for me Erich von Stroheim's great silent film Greed. Now von Stroheim was a bit of a madman, and certainly a fraud in many ways. Just amusingly, when he immigrated to the United States, he tried to claim that he was the son of Austrian nobility, which is a complete lie. Shades of our James Fitzjames there in a sense, but... Greed depicts characters trying to survive in a landscape that is trying to kill them, and it depicts them losing themselves in the process. If they ever remake this film, I'd suggest Jared Harris for the role of McTeague. It is Greed also that brought to mind the theme of this final episode, and I'll have a few more things to say about that later. And so, my friends, without further ado...
To get ourselves a treat.
Delicious.
Episode 10 begins on a long shot of the Arctic landscape, panning across the waste, eventually finding a few tattered tents, and Hickey, standing there amongst them, staring off into the distance, like the Messiah that he imagines himself, while in the background his men return to camp with the kidnapped Crozier. Crozier's been beaten and the blood is dried, or perhaps frozen, to his face. He looks into the faces of the men who cast their lot with Hickey. He studies them like he's always done, and he can see some regret there. Chef Diggle looks like he's seen a ghost. Crozier approaches Hickey, and Hickey asks him if he knows what day it is, and Crozier has no idea. Now, this kind of reflects their power differential at this moment, but it's also a slight foreshadowing of the ending. Hickey has kept time as a European, even here, but Crozier has lost all sense of the days of the week. He is perhaps keeping time more like an Inuit now. They discuss the earlier scene where Crozier shared a drink with Hickey and they toasted to themselves. At the time, Crozier thought that Hickey was a poor Irishman like himself, and perhaps saw a young version of himself in the young man. Now he says that it was a bad joke he was trying to make, and perhaps it was a joke at both of their expense. Perhaps referring to how they as Irishmen would never be seen as true equals in the Admiralty. Now, these two characters have been linked for the entire series, and I would like to put forward a brief analysis as to how. And to do so, we gotta say a few words about naturalism. You see, my friends, Greed was based on a book called McTeague by a guy by the name of Frank Norris, who also wrote The Octopus, from which I acquired the epigraph to this very review. Now, Norris died very young, and he was an extremely racist, perhaps in the modern sense, rather repugnant individual, kind of a product of his times, but he did also write some excellent and compelling fiction, which comes down to us as an artifact of the views and concerns of the era, and he worked firmly in the naturalist school. So what is naturalism. Well, simply put, you are where you are because of your nature. In spite of free will, or anything you could possibly sway as an individual, lower class people are so because they deserve to be. Their heredity and their genetics, and to a lesser extent their environment, all control their fate. You are where you are, and more importantly almost, you have what you have because your nature dictated that it would be so. Now, this idea obviously has very deep roots in human thought. Even the ancient Stoics supported a version of it. But the modern literary school was founded by a guy called Émile Zola, who was deeply influenced by Charles Dickens, who we saw earlier in this series. Of course, the modern incarnation of the idea was deeply influenced by Darwin, which was new and fresh at the time, and created all sorts of weird racist hooey that was bandied about in the age of imperialist Europe. The relevance here is this. Crozier and Hickey are each in their own way a commentary on naturalism. Crozier has risen above his station, and while his intelligence, work ethic, and character could only carry him so far, they have carried him as far as is possible in his society, which is quite far indeed. Hickey has, in a sense, on the other hand, embraced his station in life. He was born to a low-born peasant family that had probably produced a lot of crooks, and he became a crook. But in that earlier scene, you see his desire for upward mobility. You see in the scene in the next episode where he tells his lover Gibson that Crozier sees something in me. You see him striving in a sense, but he always falls back on his naturalistic upbringing. Hickey is an argument in favor of naturalism, while Crozier is the critique. They are two sides of the same coin. Hickey tells Armitage to have Goodsir tend to Crozier's injuries, and Armitage makes a crack about how Crozier caught a beating on the way over. Crozier notices that Hickey is wearing Fitzjames' boots, in spite of how insistent that he was that Fitzjames' body not be able to be found. Another thing that the show has in common with Greed, and really all of von Stroheim's work, is the discordant cuts between unrelated images that, in a sense, kind of form a commentary all their own. I've said from my very first review of this show that the editing is exceptional, and this episode is no different. In the next frame, we get a shot of the waste, stretching all the way to the horizon, white land meeting white sky, and then there's this sudden smash cut to Edward Little's face, and a voice telling him that the men have been assembled for him. Little is in command now, and he has to get them through this incredibly vast waste that we saw just a frame before we cut to just the close-up of his face. Little gives a speech about how they need to go rescue the captain. You could tell he's trying to meet that arousing tone that Franklin had so well practiced all those years ago now. But the men are skeptical. They bring up Crozier's orders to keep moving south. Little is adamant that they have to go and rescue Crozier, but the men are ready to desert him. And Little makes an excellent case for Crozier's rescue, arguing that they have to have Crozier to survive the rest of the way. So it's even in their own selfish interest. And yet, the men are spent. They voted to continue on without Crozier. They consider him lost. Ironically, they are ratifying Crozier's order to leave him for dead, and ignoring the order of his subordinate, their current captain ostensibly, Little, to go and attempt a rescue. And in this moment, Little kind of breaks down. His whole pretense of appealing to the men's selfishness fails. And he reveals that he can't believe that they would leave Crozier in Hickey's hands. They have voted to continue on, but they've also voted that it's every man for himself. They are leaving behind the men who can't haul, and Little points out that Crozier also ordered that would not be happening. So they're picking and choosing which orders they choose to follow. He appeals to them one last time, and the last word before the opening credits is survive. Now, esteemed commenter Perry brought up some interesting points about the credit sequence of the show in a comment on a previous review. One curious thing I thought about the visuals is that Fitzjames and Franklin's faces melt away to reveal skulls underneath, but Crozier's face melts away to reveal the mask that the Inuit man was wearing way back in episode 1. Foreshadowing. So Goodsir is treating Crozier, and Crozier guesses correctly that Little wants to come and rescue him. He guesses incorrectly on kind of the rest of his men, but Crozier asks Goodsir who is carrying the guns in the camp, and at first he mentions Gibson among them, but then he remembers that he himself butchered Gibson for the men to consume. And Goodsir is understandably confused in this duress, I would say. Crozier keeps on pushing as if they have some kind of chance of survival, making plans and such. telling Goodsir to go southeast if he has a chance to escape. And Goodsir ignores this and offers Crozier the ring. Now, the ring would take, frankly, too long to talk about here. This review is already going to go pretty long. I will probably do a later supplementary review on the ring. But the point is, Goodsir knows that he is going to die here. Crozier tells Goodsir that even if God is watching him, he is clean. I think he knows that Goodsir was forced to butcher Gibson. And Goodsir asks him if God is here, Captain. Any God. Why, yes, Mr. Goodsir, there is at least one God. He's right there. Right there. But Goodsir hands over the ring with like a small, look outside just to make sure nobody's looking. And Crozier says he will find the owner's sister by his name. But Goodsir can't remember his name. This again reinforces the connections to Zola's naturalism as man's rational, compassionate side, the side that has created human society and language and given each other names, is in constant conflict with the beta humani, the human beast. Manson comes to collect Crozier, but before he leaves, Goodsir tells him that if he is still in the camp when Goodsir himself is consumed, eat only of the soles of his feet, the toughest part if possible. I think Crozier senses the plan immediately, that he's going to poison himself. And at last, Crozier accepts that Goodsir's done. And he follows Manson out the door. Jobson awakens in his tent to see the men outside sledging away from them. He looks over at the man beside him, and he also senses exactly just what has happened, that they've been deemed too weak to bring with them. He looks outside his tent, and he finds 3 tins of Goldner supplies left in front of each tent, as their mates abandon them. Jobson crawls towards them, and he begins to hallucinate this table, spread out before him with this beautiful feast. And at the end of the table is Crozier, speaking with some unseen person to his right. Now, Jobson begins pushing the food off the table, trying to get down to Crozier. He's not interested in the food. If he can get to Crozier, he'll be saved. He calls out for Crozier, lying there in the spot where he will likely die, as the men abandon him. A truly heartbreaking end for a good, loyal, decent man. There are probably many ways you could interpret this imagery, but I think of it as kind of like a teach a man to fish versus give him a fish kind of thing. Going after the food on the table would have been like give him a fish, whereas I think Jobson saw Crozier in their society, in their life, as teaching him to fish. Crozier was, even as Jobson was his servant, Crozier was his ticket to a better life. Especially as Crozier himself grew up a poor Irishman and, kind of made good. So I think Jobson probably saw him as his lifeline, and even as he was hallucinating, he still, in a sense, saw it in the embodiment of Crozier a lifeline for himself. Hickey is sitting there like a messiah in his tent. He holds court now. People come to him. And Crozier comes to him. Crozier tries to get him to allow Hodgson, Diggle, and Manson to go back and fetch the other men. And he says he forgives them. And Hickey says something very interesting here. He says that Crozier holds himself to the standard of a man that he isn't and should have never tried to be. He says that he's let shame drive him on. And in this, Hickey is absolutely correct. Crozier notes much more clearly in the novel about how it is the shame of his failures with women that sting him the hardest. It's the whole reason that he listened when Sophia Craycroft asked him to go and protect her uncle. Hickey also says that he has nowhere near an equal on the expedition, save for Crozier. It makes that comment about how Crozier holds himself to the standard of a man that he isn't all the more interesting. Remember, naturalism means that you are determined by your heredity. They are 2 sides of that coin of naturalism. They discuss the Tuunbaq and how it's a spirit who wears the body of a creature, and yet they drew its blood with cannon shot. What possible mythology could this creature be at the center of? Asks Hickey. Well, it's probably about time we say a few words about Inuit religion. So what is this Tuunbaq, and what is it drawn from? Well, it doesn't actually exist in Inuit religion, but Simmons drew extremely heavily upon Inuit religion to create his monster. Now, this is described much more in detail in the novel, but essentially, the Tuunbaq is a living weapon. It's a leftover from the war between the gods that occurred millennia ago. It was created to be a killing machine, by the goddess Sedna, who is a real part of Inuit religion. Now, this is absolutely the YouTube Wikipedia version of this, and I'm collapsing like thousands of years and an enormous amount of religious culture into a soundbite, and I'm going to mangle these pronunciations, so please don't be mad at me about that. But there are several aspects of various Inuit religious traditions upon which Simmons drew here. So in general, the Inuit do believe that all things have a spirit or a soul. The Anurnik, I told you I was going to mangle this, which also means breath. By the way, in Latin, the word for spirit, animus, also means breath. Kind of interesting, very distant, different peoples. But now the spirits for a single class of thing, be it seals or fish or birds or bears, they were all held to be kind of the same in some sense and could be invoked by a master who was the keeper of that class of thing. The Ungakuk were the priests or medicine men, though historically they were often also women. Somewhat like Lady Silence, you might say. And they could communicate with and manage these Anurnit. Now, there was also something called a Tuunbaq. Does that word look familiar? Which was a spirit that was not connected to a physical body. Now, some of them could indeed wear bodies at times, and some of them could indeed be quite evil and monstrous. It was held that an Ungakuk could exercise some kind of control over them. They can fight them or exercise them or hold them at bay with various rituals, like throat singing or perhaps sacrificing your tongue to it. The term Tuunbaq at one time simply meant killing spirit, though in the Christianized world it came to mean demon. Diggle is laid out and Crozier is sitting up with his back to the tent wall, and Diggle offers to spring Crozier's cuffs for him. He says he may be able to run before dawn, but Crozier tells him his plan is to take some of them back with him. Diggle says that he'll help him, and we already see the effect that having a true leader like Crozier is having on swaying the men away from some demagogue like Hickey. And then, at last, Goodsir is finished. He washes his body down in an ointment which he pours into a small bowl. I believe perhaps to dull the pain of the poison. And then he downs an entire bottle of something. The book's Goodsir accomplished this by squirreling away quarter shots of the pain medicine that Hickey was expecting him to feed to Manson and the others. But it's less clear here exactly what it is. And in a sense, it doesn't matter. And then Goodsir gets dressed, even going so far as to carefully tie his tie, and he waits. And it doesn't take long. Whatever he did to dull his pain, he didn't seem to do enough. He doubles over in agony, opens the cloth full of broken glass he's been carting around, and he slashes his wrists. I was just thinking this show isn't heartbreaking enough. As he's dying, Goodsir hallucinates the close-up of a plant against a white backdrop, and a mollusk of some kind, and a different plant of some kind. I don't know if this is some reference to his botanist tendencies. I don't have a ton of insight into what this meant. It was very intriguing, and if somebody has an idea, please do leave it in the comments for me. Diggle and Crozier wake up to DeVoe forcing Crozier up and out of the tent. He comes outside to a grotesque scene, discordant in its bizarre imagery. The men are all gathered on crates around a larger crate in the middle of them, kind of serving as a dining table. The image is that of them sitting down to dinner. Crozier walks a little further around the corner to find Goodsir's partially butchered corpse, and he realizes the meal they are sitting down to. There was actually a somewhat similar scene in Greed that was intended to have the same sort of shock value at the time. It's a wedding banquet where the guests devour their food like ravenous animals. Well, at the time Greed was made, meals were a staid, pious, sort of buttoned-up affair. But anyway, Crozier thinks that the others have murdered Goodsir to eat him, and then he is told of the suicide. Goodsir has killed himself to poison the others. At first, Crozier refuses to eat of his dead friend, but remembering his earlier words, he eventually goes over and slices off some of the sole of his foot. He stabs his knife into the wood, holding his dead friend's body, and then he eats the flesh of his dead friend. He catches Diggle's eye and gives him a small shake of the head, and Diggle does not eat. In the meantime, Hickey tells them that there's something they're going to do now that Crozier is with them. They're going to climb the hill, and it's something to do with the boat chain. Then Hickey picks up his gun and knocks out Tozier with the butt of it. Tozier would have fought him on this plan. Back in England, James Ross apprises the Admiralty of his rescue mission. He says that they will come at it from the east, west, and south. The man he is speaking to says that he will bring comfort to his father, and it is not made clear in the scene who this is, but I suspect very much that this is George Barrow that Ross is speaking to. George Barrow, of course, is the idiot who got into a compromising situation in Singapore and got his ass bailed out by our dude, Fitzjames. Hickey's captives sledge their remaining boat up to the top of the hill. Hickey orders Pilkington to fire a shot into the pre-dawn sky. And Hickey calls out here, "Terror! Here, terror!" Now this is of course a reference to the multifaceted title of the book, where terror is both the ship, the creature, and the madness that takes over the men. This is yet another magnificent scene. Crozier notes that the beast is sick by what he's eaten, sick by the lead-poisoned men. Hodgson begins speaking French, and Hickey demands that he translates, and he says, "Tell me what you eat, and I'll tell you what you are." The men appear to believe that they're there to kill the creature and butcher it, and at last get back to London. Hickey reveals at last that he has a different plan, and quote-unquote Hickey at last reveals himself. He says that a man called Hickey told him that the expedition would be a year in the ice, and then out the other side to dry out in the Sandwich Islands, aka Hawaii. So he dabbed him and ditched the body. Crozier tells him that he could have joined up, and Hickey says that he was going to leave them when he got there and start fresh in Oahu or Maui or any of the other islands. And then the scene acquires a bit of a grotesque tone when Hickey begins singing "God Bless Our Native Land." And it's to the tune of "God Bless America," by the way. I don't know if it always has been, but it would make sense. And he's singing this as his mates like starve and lay on the rocks all around him, and he insists that they sing along with him. And he gives this wonderful speech all about how perhaps the Britons are not the protagonists of this story. How in Shoreditch, how when he was in the presence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, he never saw that holy shine as he does in exactly that moment. All while Sergeant Tozier actually tries to get them into place to mount a proper defense. Now, this scene is wonderful in its madness. Every shot is just perfect. As Manson collapses, Mr. Horror runs off, and Armitage ponders his targets before Manson guns him down. There's a missing beat there where Manson was down, and then before we know he's up again and shooting, and that missing beat only adds to just the discordant madness that we're dealing with here. In some ways, it reminds me of the last 20 minutes of Jaws, but in a sort of this chaotic, insane way. And then the creature shows up. And this is an outstanding action scene, as Crozier is chained to these men and the Tuunbaq picks them off one by one. He's connected to them, physically and emotionally, as they die. Diggle is the first to go. He runs, in spite of Crozier telling him he shouldn't, and the Tuunbaq runs him down and basically eats him alive. Hodgson is next to go. Crozier yells at him to be still, but he is not still, and the Tuunbaq picks him up by the head and eats his head. We don't see Manson be eaten, but if you turn on subtitles on Amazon Prime, it reads, "Flesh being ripped." And this is when Hickey takes his tongue between his fingers, takes out his knife, and cuts out his own tongue. This is the Messiah's big moment. It's his time to shine. His time to take control of the monster. His time to become an Angakuk. Tozier and Crozier are far from mates, certainly, but they're two of the last few left sane and alive. So Crozier tosses one of his rifles to Tozier, and Tozier is eaten off-screen. At this point, the Tuunbaq begins pulling Crozier into him by the boat chain. As he's eaten the men, he's been consuming the chain with them. When you were a kid, did you ever have that really gross friend who'd, swallow half of a spaghetti noodle and then, try to take it back out? That's basically the Tuunbaq right now. And then, Hickey offers the beast his severed tongue in the palm of his hand. This is incredibly disgusting, but that's this show. The creature gives it a sniff, and then he bites Hickey's arm at the elbow. I think this was not how Hickey saw this interaction going down in his mind. At this point, the beast rips Hickey in half at the waist, which is, of course, a callback to the men we saw several episodes ago, where the corpse that the creature left on the boat, which was the top half of one guy and the bottom half of a totally different guy. And then it's trying to swallow Hickey, essentially, a severed torso first, and Crozier manages to use Hickey's body to keep the beast far enough away from him, while looping the chain around Hickey's dead body and pulling it tight to choke the beast. And here they have a standoff where Crozier is looking into its creepy, kind of too human eyes, and the Tuunbaq asphyxiates. And that's the end of the Tuunbaq. So let's just get it out of the way. A lot of people hated this. People said it was anticlimactic after the beast, got this just wonderful build-up and terrifying setup. In the end, it ended up just being so mundane and killable, and that really bothered some people. I'm interested to know what y'all thought, but I didn't hate it for a lot of reasons. So, number one, just from a filmmaking standpoint, the idea that this mundane death was somehow beneath the rest of the series, I just don't see that. I mean, think about Jaws. Chief Brody killed the shark by shooting an oxygen tank stuck in its mouth. Think about Alien. Ellen Ripley killed the first xenomorph by blowing it out the airlock and firing the engines at it. And Alien and Jaws are, I feel, both very good comparisons to how the Terror treated its monster. You don't see them until well into the story, in all three cases, and each of them dies in a reasonably mundane, somewhat realistic fashion. Number two, they've already established that the creature can be harmed through mundane means. When it had Blanky essentially treed in the masts of Terror, the men shot at it with a cannon and they wounded it. Fitzjames shot it with a damn rocket, and it didn't like that one bit. Earlier in this episode, Hickey and Crozier discuss how it can be harmed by physical means, and physical creatures generally need to breathe. Physical creatures are generally poisoned by eating poisoned meat. Physical creatures are generally poisoned by eating lead, and it's been well established that the men are being poisoned by lead and by having eaten Goodsir's body. Thirdly and finally, this may be a partial reference to the novel. In the novel, when Hickey and the Tuunbaq have their confrontation, the Tuunbaq rejects Hickey because of his poisonous soul. It won't even eat him. It's kind of more in keeping with the creature's origins as an Inuit spirit, and it smells him and it refuses to eat him because his soul was so repugnant. So that may be a third reason why his body had that effect on the creature. And for all those reasons, I think this is just a fine death for the Tuunbaq. Crozier collapses on the rocks after choking the creature out. It wounded his chest, and he lays his head down, perhaps to die. He really has nothing left to live for. Lady Silence and another of her people are crossing the landscape, when Silence's companion leaves her to go on alone. And she first runs across DeVoe, who begs her to help him, and she does not help him. He collapses, to die where he falls. She finds the dead Tuunbaq, its eyes still open. As she blows on its face, giving some credence to that whole Inuit religion, breath equals spirit kind of thing, and she sprinkles some water in its mouth. She is characteristically stoic, but you can tell she is affected by its death. She finds Crozier, the chain still connected to the dead Tuunbaq around his wrist, and she's not able to break the chain. So she slaps him to see if he's awake and if he can feel anything. And when she finds he's unresponsive, she basically straight up Jaime Lannister's his hand. It worked in Saw. They find Hickey's old camp, and she sees Goodsir's partially eaten corpse. And now, for one of the few times in the series that we see her face affected by genuine emotion. She is pained to see him like this. These scenes are almost entirely silent, and they are incredibly effective. We get that scene from the book where Silence is treating Crozier's wounds, nursing him back to health. He's delirious in his pain and sickness, talking to himself, but he lives, and one morning he wakes up. Feeling like hell, but he's on the mend. He very confusedly discovers the stump of his left wrist. But he takes it pretty well. Silence comes in and feeds him. And Crozier says that they need to go south, but they also must find his men. So they're crossing the landscape, him kind of lumbering along and her leading the way. And they find a broken down old tent. He finds Jopson, dead where he lay from trying to crawl across the rocks to follow the men who were abandoning him to die. The others never even made it that far, and the small offering of Goldner's tins still remain in front of their broken down old tents. They find the next camp, which is strewn with books and plates and various other things that are mostly incredibly useless to carry around in this environment. There's a nice little moment where Crozier finally runs ahead and grabs the line of Silence's sled, helping her tow it. Crozier pulls his weight, at all times, and they cross the ice to Little's camp. The tents are broken and battered, and the sledge boat is empty, everything's strewn about. There are some bones and a man's severed foot and the remains of a campfire. This is, of course, a direct reference to the evidence described by Charles Francis Hall in his interviews with the Inuit, who described to Hall what they had seen as far as the remains of the Franklin expedition. They find many corpses huddled together, dead. having frozen or starved to death trying to use each other's body heat to stay alive. Now, Crozier finds Edward Little, who is incredibly still alive. He has gold chains all sort of gruesomely attached to his face, hooked into his lips, nose, and his cheeks just below the eyes, and he can only whisper one word, "Close," before he dies. Now, this word close is a callback to an earlier conversation where Jopson notes how close they are to getting out of the ice, and Crozier snaps at him. He says that close is worse than nothing. It's the worst thing in the world. But what about the chains? Now, there's been much talk about this scene online, and, many theories abound. So what exactly is going on here? Well, per Tracy Palmer at signalhorizon.com, big shout out and big thanks, we've got what I regard as a fairly plausible theory. First of all, piercings have an extremely deep history in maritime culture. They could improve eyesight, improve luck, but perhaps more notably, they were thought to have the ability to cure sickness. Again, so they thought. So it's quite possible that Little, in his sickened, weakened, maddened state, thought that the piercings would cure the sickness that was killing him. Secondly, Inuit oral histories tell of just this thing happening. They tell stories of Englishmen with gold-adorned faces wandering the Arctic. It's now believed by many that these were the dying men of the Franklin expedition. But Little dies in Crozier's arms. Silence returns to the Netzilik village with Crozier in tow. The others don't really seem that happy to see either of them, but Crozier sits down with the Angakuk from the series' opening scene. Now, the Holy Man says that Silna, aka Lady Silence, told him that Crozier is alone now, and Crozier says that his men have died. And this is yet another brilliantly acted scene by Jared Harris, as his face begins to break and his eyes get wet as he describes, how he's failed to get his men out alive. The Holy Man tells Crozier that he will stay with them until the spring, when he can decide where he wants to go. And Crozier is blown away that they've forgiven him for killing the Tuunbaq, and the Angakuk only tells him that they were very sad and they cried when they heard what happened, and then he asks him to tell him the story of when the Tuunbaq died. Now, this is perhaps a bit underexplained, but I think they forgive him due to some differing attitudes towards crime and retribution in Inuit cultures. Witness, for instance, the words of Canadian author Rachel Atatuk Kutsualik. The Inuit cosmos is ruled by no one. There are no divine mother and father figures. There are no wind gods and solar creators. There are no eternal punishments in the hereafter, as there are no punishments for children or adults in the here and now. In other words, they don't conceive of a punishing authority. What's done is done, and that doesn't affect how they will treat Crozier going forward. For Lady Silence, however, it's a very different story. She is sent off into exile. The Angakuk tells Crozier that she must go be alone now because the Tuunbaq is gone. Now, Crozier initially intends to go after her, but the priest tells him yet again, everyone accepts this. She's gone into exile, that's their way. I'm struck here by how there's a difference between punishment and consequences. And we cut ahead to 1850. A man comes back into the village to tell them that 2 white men are coming, and Crozier is still with the Netzilik village. The Angakuk asks him what he wants to do, and Crozier tells him in Netzilik. And it's literally the opening scene from the series. It's James Ross and his interpreter come to look for the Franklin expedition. Ross pulls out the photographs of the captains, and it's revealed that Crozier was right outside the tent the entire time as they spoke. And the Holy Man relays Crozier's message. He says, tell them the ships are gone. There is no way through, no passage. Tell them that we are gone, dead and gone. And Crozier and 2 other adults set out across the ice, towing sleds carrying children. And the final image we see of him is him patiently waiting at a seal hole. A sleeping child on his leg, he's holding a spear with his one good hand. And the white-on-white negative space of the Arctic just surrounds the 2 of them as the camera pans back. And the soundtrack, by the way, is particularly effective in this final scene. And thus ends Season 1 of The Terror. So how plausible is this end for Crozier? Is it possible that Crozier or any of the other men could have been taken in by Inuit society? Well, as it turns out, it's entirely possible, perhaps even probable. As James Lewin has noted, Europeans were always trying to stop the outflow. Hernando de Soto had to post guards to keep his men and women from defecting to native societies. The Pilgrims so feared Indianization that they made it a crime for men to wear long hair. People who did run away to the Indians might expect very extreme punishments, even up to the death penalty, Karen Kupperman tells us, if caught by whites. Nonetheless, right up to the end of independent native nationhood in 1890, whites continued to defect. This idea that the experience of imperialism was a one-way domination of European over American is drastically oversimplified. It's entirely plausible that some men of the Franklin expedition lived out their lives in Netzalik society. Now, some others have noted the change from the book's ending, and we might as well say a few words about that here. So, in the novel, Crozier ends up essentially married to Silence, and the final image is them staring out over Terror as the ship burns to the ground. So, as to changing Crozier's relationship with Silence, I think from a storytelling standpoint, it just makes sense. So, I love Simmons' novel, but it must be said that the growth of the relationship in the book is not terribly well depicted. Crozier basically hates her. He expresses the exact same kind of racism towards her that all the other men do. And then she rescues him and nurses him back to health, and they just kind of end up having sex in the igloo. Contrasted to the show, her relationship with Goodsir grows a lot more naturally, I feel. It just makes sense that the curious and open-hearted Goodsir would give her a chance and be interested in her and develop feelings towards her. I actually like this change quite a lot. So as to the other change, why didn't we end on the destruction of Terror? Well, part of that has to do with the exact same reason that Fitzjames got the backstory of his illegitimacy, and that was not in the book. Simmons published his novel in 2007, and obviously this show was released in 2018. And in 2016, the wreck of the Terror was discovered. The story of the Terror's discovery is almost as incredible as the story of the Franklin expedition itself. Now, Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper initiated the search for the wreckage in 2008. In 2016, the director of the search, Adrian Shimnowski, was kind of shooting the breeze with native crew member Sammy Kovic. Now, Kovic told him about a hunting trip that he took in 2010, where he and a buddy saw a big piece of wood, kind of like a mast, sticking up out of the sea ice. He took several pictures of himself hugging this mast-like piece of wood, but he lost the camera on the way back. Now, Sammy considered this to be an omen of evil spirits, so he didn't mention it to anybody, until talking about it with Shimnowski 6 years later. To nobody's surprise, the ship was exactly where Kovic said it would be, perfectly preserved. So well preserved, in fact, that the windows to Crozier's cabin are still intact. Now, the ship was battened down and it looked ready to sail, which led some to believe that some of the men remained and hoped to sail out eventually, as depicted in this show. And finally, it's kind of a strange irony that due to Arctic sea ice decline brought on by climate change, the Northwest Passage is now readily navigable. The Danish bulk carrier Nordic Orion passed from Vancouver, Canada to Finland via the Northwest Passage in late 2013, and 2 years later, a cruise ship successfully navigated the passage. And in 2017, 33 vessels sailed the passage, easily passing through those waters that once stymied Franklin and Crozier 170 years previously. Put another way, within 2 years of rediscovering their ships, Franklin and Crozier's mission was accomplished. So I'm not going to mince words with you fine folks. In my opinion, The Terror is one of the best shows ever made. I don't use that superlative lightly, and I will not be so uniformly positive about almost anything else I ever review in my time here on YouTube, but over the course of its 10 episodes, the show has rocketed into my top 10 of all time, and perhaps in time it will reach even higher. It's clearly the kind of show that will reward repeat viewings, and it will be talked about for a long, long time. The show took exceptional source material in Simmons' novel and adapted it exceptionally well. I really have almost no complaints about it, from the acting to the writing to the directing to the sets to the costumes. Every little detail was top-notch. I didn't even talk about this before, but the tinted glasses that Crozier wears when they're marching, just such a pair was discovered on the expedition. Just amazing attention to detail. It's such a treat when every little detail is seen to, and everyone cares about what they're doing. So I know it's been renewed for a second season, and it's probably going to go kind of the American Horror Story route, which is i.e. a different story every season, and that's cool. If it's the same production team that's in charge, it may not measure up to this season, but I suspect it will be worth watching. So there's a select group of folks who have kind of been with me this entire journey, and I'm off script now, folks. I'm just kind of shooting from the hip, so it's probably a little bit of a ramble, but there's a few folks who have been kind of commenting on all the previous reviews that I did for the show. And I definitely wanted to give those folks a shout out because it's been a lot of fun, you know, talking to them and interacting with them and just, talking about great stories. You know, that's what I'm passionate about, is just great storytelling. And I can tell all these folks are as well. So I just wanted to shout them out here too at the end of the season. So without further ado, Perry Wilmarth, Perry, you're a great man. Your comments crack me up. Connie Miles, Jim Wind, Barney's Doggy's Mama, Adam Pohl, Aprazolam 1 MGS, all of you guys. Great fun chatting with you all throughout, you know, reviewing this. And if I didn't mention you, it doesn't mean that I didn't appreciate your comments. And you know what? I'm sure there's a ton of people that watched all of them but didn't necessarily comment. And I appreciate you just as much. Just, I don't know your name. So I call out the people who I know their name and I enjoyed, you know, chatting with them throughout the season. But anyways, yeah, I appreciate you guys. I love you guys. As long as you're interested in me reviewing and talking about stuff, I'll keep making them. And I'm sure you're not going to like everything I make, and that's cool. But, you know, stick around and I'll probably make something else you like. So just keep an eye out. But anyways, been really fun getting to know you guys and, you know, chatting with you guys in the comments. And I really want this channel to eventually be sort of a community built around great storytelling. And all of you are absolutely a part of that. So, yeah, ramble. It's, but in any case, as far as the future goes, if there's something else that you would like to hear my thoughts on, leave it in the comments of a video. Say, hey, why don't you go review this? I can't promise you that I'll get to it right away, but I will add it to my list, and I will get to it when I can. You know, I kind of pride myself on being a very interactive, very responsive YouTuber, and if you want to hear my thoughts on some movie or some TV show, you know what? I'll give it a look and I'll give you my thoughts on it. It'll go on my list. You have my word about that. So, anyways, one more time, the folks that I'd like to shout out especially, just because they were commenting on most of the videos. First and foremost, Perry Wilmarth, Connie Miles, Jim Wins, Barney's Doggy's Mama, Adam Pohl, Aprolazam 1 MGS. You guys are great. Everybody else that watched but didn't comment, you're all great as well. And let's just keep on talking about wonderful stories like The Terror, one of the greatest TV shows ever made. And I'm sure I will have more to say about it in the future. But for now, we're closing that book. All right, friends, that's it for now. Until next time, world-renowned historian. Be good, kiddos. I am out.